This way.
Does that sound all right?
Yes, I think so. Well, I know I'm between you guys, so I'm in the right.
Good afternoon. You hear me? Okay. 2018 marks the 100th anniversary of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which has been described by the World Health Organization as one of the largest public health crises in modern history. A pandemic is a new infectious illness that spreads across the world. According to the Centers for Disease Control, influenza pandemics occur when a new influenza virus emerges that is able to infect people easily and spread from person to person in an efficient and sustained way. In the book Station 11, an influenza pandemic known as the Georgia flu rapidly spreads across the globe, leading to devastating consequences. Today's panel will address the realities of influenza pandemics and the important role vaccines play. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our panel, Dr. Rita Rio. Dr. Rita Rio is a professor of biology in the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Rio received her bachelor's degree from the University of Connecticut, her master's degree from Penn State, and her PhD from Yale University. She joined the faculty in 2007 and was instrumental in developing a departmental emphasis in genomics. Dr. Rito's research on the evolution of host-associated microbiotas and the role these play in health and ecology has won national funding. Her lab focuses on the discovery of novel molecules and methods with a particular focus on microbiota applications for the biocontrol of vector-borne diseases. Dr. Rito serves on the editorial review board of the journals Applied and Environmental Microbiology, Frontiers of Microbiology, and Scientific Reports. She serves on advisory panels for the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Rito.
All right, thank you so much for the invitation to moderate this panel. I'd like to first introduce each member of the panel. So starting from your far right, we have Dr. Diane Gross. She is a DVM PhD, an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology. Dr. Gross also serves as the regional epidemiologist at the Mon County Health Department. She has over 25 years of clinical and epidemiological practice in the United States and internationally. During this time, she worked to prevent and control infectious diseases of public health importance, as well as establishing and conducting surveillance, teaching, and performing research in more than 50 countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Dr. Gross served as senior epidemiologist for the International Influenza Program at the CDC and the High Threat Pathogen Program at the WHO Regional Office of Europe. Dr. Costello is an MD, MPH. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Internal Medicine and Pediatrics at WVU. Dr. Costello received her bachelor's in biology, MD, and MPH degrees, all from West Virginia University. Her clinical duties include being the director of the Mountain State Cystic Fibrosis Adult Program and a pediatric hospitalist at WVU Medicine Children's Hospital. In addition to serving on the WVU School of Medicine Committee on Admissions, she also leads a healthcare literacy and patient advocacy curriculum thread for the MD program. Dr. Costello currently serves on the executive committee of the American Academy of Pediatrics section on early career physicians, is the vice president and legislative committee chair for the West Virginia American Academy of Pediatrics, and as a West Virginia Political Action Committee board member. In 2017, she received the Margaret Buchanan Cole Young Alumnus Award from the WVU Alumni Association. In May of 2018, Governor Justice appointed her to the West Virginia Children's Health Insurance, West Virginia CHIP program. Her academic interests include advocacy, healthcare policy, social media, and improving communication with patients, healthcare professionals, and the public by utilizing technology and media to amplify advocacy and education. Dr. Heath Dameron received his BS, all from Marshall University. During his PhD research, he focused on the genetic regulation of virulence factors of the opportunistic pathogen Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which infects people with cystic fibrosis. His postdoc work continued on bacteria that infect cystic fibrosis patients, and specifically, he studied how bacteria cause infection. He then transitioned to study Bordetella pertussis, which causes the disease whooping cough, also known as pertussis. Today, his lab seeks to develop more effective pertussis vaccines, and the work is funded by the NIH. Dr. Dameron is the director of the Vaccine Development Center, which is funded by the West Virginia Higher Education Planning Commission. In addition to pertussis, the Vaccine Development Center is interested in developing vaccines against several other respiratory pathogens, and there are currently 11 funded projects in progress. Renee Nicholson. Dr. Renee Nicholson is a creative writer and assistant professor in the programs for multi and interdisciplinary studies in the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. She authored the poetry collection Roundabout Directions to Lincoln Center, was a consulting writer on Jamie Shumway's memoir Off Belay, One Last Great Adventure, a co-editor on the anthology Bodies of the Truth, Personal Narratives of Illness, Disability, and Medicine. She has worked on several narrative medicine projects with patients receiving care through WVU Medicine and is finishing her professional certificate in narrative medicine through Columbia University. And lastly, Dr. Marina Galvez is an assistant professor of the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences at the School of Pharmacy. She teaches and coordinates several courses in the pharmacy curriculum, including immunology. Dr. Galvez's educational research focuses on the application of critical thinking and how public information affects students' perceptions. One teaching approach that she uses is the design of debates and controversial topics like vaccinations. She has authored over 30 manuscripts and serves as associate editor at BMC Pharmacology and Toxicology and is a member of several organizations within WVU, including Women in Science and Health, the Association for Women in Science, the American Association of Pharmaceutical Sciences, and the Medical Spanish Association. So let's give a warm welcome to our panel. All right, thank you. So we're going to start the panel just by having a few questions that have already been planned, and then we'd like to open it up to the audience. So I'm going to start off by asking anyone on the panel to respond to what is a pandemic? What does a pandemic mean to you? How likely are these? And how likely are these?
I can start with pandemic. So if you look, Merriam-Webster defines a pandemic as an outbreak of disease that occurs over a wide geographic area and with an exceptionally high proportion of the population becoming infected. So historically, we tend to think of things like the Black Plague caused by Yersinia pestis, which estimates say up to 50% of Europe was affected over the centuries and killing off up to 50%. You can look at HIV and consider it a pandemic because you've had, since 1987, 70 million people have been infected with about 35 million deaths to date. You could even look at rabies as a pandemic. Rabies is prevalent on all continents in the world except Antarctica. It's pretty much 100% fatal if a human becomes infected, and typically 50,000 people have rabies. Currently, that's occurring mainly in the developing countries, and here in the U.S., we only have maybe 2 to 3 deaths from rabies a year, and those are from people infected by animals. Globally, it's dogs that mainly cause rabies outbreaks, rabies cases in humans. In the U.S., it's more bats, or here in West Virginia, our concern would be from raccoons. So if you're worried about getting a severe illness today here in West Virginia, you are more at risk from rabies than from pandemic flu. But so I think that other people, though, we often consider part of the definition of a pandemic something that's explosive, that comes on rapidly, and something that's severe. And that's where we get worried about influenza, because influenza is a virus that's constantly changing and mutating. It can change constantly as it replicates, has minor changes, and we call this drifting. And so it's antigenic properties, or the part of the property of the virus that your body, your immune system responds to, can change a little bit over time. But then it can also have major changes, and we call this antigenic shift. And that's because influenza A viruses have 8 segments of RNA. It's not one long segment. It's actually broken up into 8. And they can actually swap out entire segments of the virus. If you have 2 different viruses in the same person or the same animal, it can swap genes or segments totally. And so we call this antigenic shift. And that's when we see, because influenza A viruses affect many different mammals, both birds and humans and other animals, pigs, dogs, horses, then you can have a virus. If you have 2 viruses in a pig, you can have those influenza virus mix, and you get a new virus that has part human influenza virus properties, and part swine influenza virus properties. And if this virus is different enough that when it infects a person, if you have no immunity to it, then this is a virus that we are worried about becoming a pandemic. And that's exactly what happened in 2009, in April of 2009, when we had a new virus appear it was first identified in the US, in San Diego, and then Texas. A virus that had come originally from swine. It had swine parts, but it had swapped to pick up some human properties. And so it was a virus that could infect people, and it could replicate easily in people and be easily transmitted from person to person. And those are the qualities of an influenza virus, an influenza A virus, that makes it one of pandemic potential. And that one did go on to cause a pandemic and spread globally around the world.
So along the same veins, how do we respond to pandemics?
Okay, so so for pandemics, there are the main way to prevent influenza is through vaccination. So being vaccinated against the influenza strain before the season starts and become infected, and by doing things to decrease your own exposure to virus. Those are things the basic hygiene recommendations of covering your cough, staying home if you're sick, washing your hands or using hand sanitizers to prevent being exposed to the virus. The problem is with a pandemic virus, a brand new virus, that it takes up to 6 months to mass produce influenza vaccine to that new strain of virus. So, for instance, in 2009, the pandemic, we identify it in April, and CDC starts working on developing a strain that can be put into use for making vaccines. And it's October, November before we're really getting enough vaccine out to start mass vaccinating. So to prevent it, we being the world, a program, the Global Influenza Program led by the World Health Organization, constantly does surveillance for influenza virus, examines those viruses, sees if they look any different from what we currently have circulating, and any viruses that are a concern, new viruses that pop up from animals into people, such as avian influenza viruses like the H5N1 or H7N9, which are currently causing problems still in Asia. When they pop up, we start getting preparations and potentially even starting vaccine production against viruses of concern, so that we will be able to mass produce vaccination as quick as possible, because that's our main line of defense.
And I would just chime in from a clinician role. Is this thing on? I've always wanted to say that. There we go. In that it's really important that everyone get vaccinated if you're eligible. So the recommendation is that if you're older than 6 months, unless you have a contraindication to get vaccinated, that you do get vaccinated. And the other items that Dr. Gross mentioned, staying home does not mean like you just get to skip class. I mean, you can curl up and watch Netflix, but you should not be going to the gym or the rec center or other areas, because you could potentially spread flu. And I think flu is incredibly contagious. It's also unpredictable, as was nicely kind of illustrated. And many a times you might have the flu, or you might be shedding the virus before you really start to have symptoms, which typically can be fever, muscle aches, feeling really tired, having muscle pains. And so those are you can have, and you can actually start shedding the virus before those symptoms even present itself. So that's what can make it really challenging. So I'm a big sports person. Anybody else watch the Mountaineers? We're undefeated. Anyone? We're going to get some, yeah, woo woo, right? Okay, yeah, like we're 6th in the country. That's like a big deal, right? So in my former life, I played on the basketball team. I was center guard, center of the bench, guarding the water bottles. And the best teams have a great defense. They also have a great offense, but they have a really great defense. And that's what vaccination is. It's giving our body the chance to have a strong defense, so that when these viruses present themselves, our body is able to mount a response and protect us from the severe consequences. Now, every year the flu vaccine changes. That's why you have to get a seasonal vaccine. And so I know every year you have to go get a shot in the arm, but that really is our best way to try to prevent these outbreaks from happening. And so you not only benefit yourself, but you also benefit those around you. So there are individuals who can't get vaccinated. So the youngest kids I care for at WVU Medicine Children's, those less than 6 months old, they're not eligible for vaccination. Or there are some individuals who have a weakened immune system and may not be able to undergo vaccination either. So there's a double benefit. Not only do you get to protect yourself, but that you also can play a role in helping to prevent the disease from spreading to those around you. So I think that that's some of the ways that, just to chime in on the importance of vaccination, and to also underscore the importance of education. So being here and learning about the flu and then communicating that is really important in how we address pandemics and try to educate others about the importance of getting vaccinated and preventing the spread of flu.
Thank you. I think you make a very important point about individual responsibility, but also how important it is to achieve this community immunity and herd immunity through ramping up these vaccination numbers. Okay, so the next question is for Lisa. So what have been our best efforts to combat the spread, severity, and mortality of seasonal flu?
I'm going to sound like a broken record. Vaccination. So I'm a pediatrician, so we like to talk about vaccines, but I really do think that vaccines have been proven time and time again to be safe, effective, and they really do save lives. They're the most effective public health intervention ever introduced. We know that there is variability in the flu vaccine success. You may see that online, that sometimes people talk about, well, this flu vaccine was not as effective as it has been in the past. And really, there's an ongoing monitoring, and I'll yield to my colleagues who actually work and develop vaccines. Cool, but way over my head. But I think that it's really important that you do your part and be a member of the team and get vaccinated if you can. There are some contraindications to vaccines, which we'll talk about a little bit later, if you have a severe allergy or, as I mentioned before, those really young children. But that's really been our best efforts in really trying to vaccinate. So here at WVU Medicine, we have a policy that if you're a healthcare professional, you have to be vaccinated unless you have a medical reason to not be. So I have my badge there, but it's this lime green sticker. I got my flu shot on Friday, so I was like all prepared to come. I took a hashtag flu shot selfie. I took some selfies earlier. If anyone would like to have a selfie later, I'm a hashtag pediatrician, like I like to self-proclaim. And so I think spreading that information to others and really encourage your colleagues and your friends to get vaccinated. So I recently read a report that millennials, which I am also in that generation, are the least likely to get flu vaccine, probably because we think that we're not going to get sick and we don't need to have the flu vaccine. If we do get the flu, it's not going to be that serious. But that's not the case for everyone. So individuals I care for who have cystic fibrosis, or the young children that I care for in the hospital who are at higher risk, if they get the flu, it could be catastrophic for them. And I've taken care of individuals who are very, very sick, and I've unfortunately also cared for individuals who have died from influenza. So really, to combat this virus and this infection, we really want to try to be promote prevention as much as we can by getting the flu vaccine, then also doing those other things like staying home if you're sick, which I know can be tough, but wearing a mask, washing your hands all the time. Those things cannot be underscored in regards to fighting off influenza, seasonal influenza, but then also if there is a pandemic, and having a coordinated response to address in regards to communication, education, and then distributing the vaccine and these medications and treatments for.
All right, this one's for Heath. How do vaccines work?
Oh, cool. Well, it's actually quite simple. As you pointed out, that's really out of your, it's not really.
Simple, I don't know if I'd go straight to
So
simple.
vaccines simply educate your immune system. So if you get infected, you can develop immunity to whatever you're infected with. Well, a vaccine just simulates that in a way that's safe. So a couple of key terms you need to know. One, we call the proteins or pieces of the virus or the bacteria that are essential to the response, antigens. So antigens typically can be proteins. For example, with flu, it happens to be a piece of the outside that allows it to attach. So if you show an antigen to the immune system and it generate an immune response, that response has a couple pieces. It has a cellular piece, which are cells that will recognize the virus or antigen and respond to it in the future. But there's also a piece of these antibodies, which are proteins. And so once you're immunized, so I was immunized yesterday, so you beat me. At this point, I imagine I have a decent number of antibodies being produced in my body. They're flowing through my blood. If my body sees flu at that particular flu and those antibodies are effective, then I won't be infected. So that's simply how they work. What's remarkable about the flu vaccine is the fact that, as our colleague on the right here said, 2 times a year it's actually reformulated. And that's different than all other vaccines because, for the example, the one I work on, DTaP and Tdap, were established in the 90s, and the exact same formulation is used every year. Flu has to be re-engineered every year just to stay effective. So that's the interesting part. So we've heard about eggs in terms of if you have an egg allergy, you can't have the flu vaccine. There happens to be versions that you can have, but in case you're curious how they make it, I don't have an egg. I don't think that would be acceptable for me to have it up here. But so you take an egg and you actually inoculate it directly with the virus. You allow the virus to grow. And inside the egg, once it grows up, you then extract out the fluid. And that fluid has live virus particles. And so if you're using a trivalent, a quadvalent, you would have 4 different versions of virus growing at the same time. And then from those versions, you simply kill them and you just disrupt the entire structure. Once the proteins are released, then you basically have to send that vaccine back to the FDA, who will do the potency test to ensure that it meets the demands. And every step along the way has quality control. It's very challenging to make it perfect like they do. And they have to make 500,000 doses or more in each run, which is incredible to think about. So then they combine the groups together, check them out, and then start shipping them. So this process, 6 months to 8 months on average. It has been performed a little bit faster during the pandemic than normal. But some interesting things I want to point out about flu is that additionally, we want to think about seasonal flu being very important in pandemic. The problem about pandemic is we just don't know which strain it's going to be. And that's the scary part. So if you start stockpiling up vaccines for pandemic flu, it could be a totally different version, and then all those vaccines were worthless. So the surveillance is critical to actually figuring out what strain you would need. But since 1918, we've had a number of immunological developments. Now we have ways to actually grow flu virus in cells and purify it directly far quicker. So for people who are allergic to eggs, there's a version you can have. So just if you're allergic, there's still a version you can actually request. And then additionally, there are people out there who've developed vaccines that are actually just DNA and RNA, and they encode the antigens directly. And so these are fast deployable mechanisms that could occur very quickly. And I actually work with a company developing this technology. And so those could be brought out within months or weeks versus 6 months. They could help solve the problem, slow it down. But pandemic is certainly a reality that's possible. Vaccine development has came a long ways since 1940 when the first vaccines were coming out. And so there is hope, but we should all get every vaccine we can to prevent any kind of carriage viewpoint.
And of course, the holy grail would be if we could develop a vaccine that's universal. So one vaccine that would affect all strains and would eliminate this problem of drift and shift. But people are working on it. We're not there yet.
How long does it take for an individual to get vaccinated and then have protection? And let's take the case of the flu.
I don't know the exact time frame because I think, unfortunately, per person, it might be a little bit different. It would probably have to do a little bit with what you've been immunized to in the past.
Right. And you generically say within 2 weeks. It's just
generic.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Which is why we say get vaccinated. Typically in the U.S., being in the northern hemisphere, and influenza, seasonal influenza, is seasonal. It is in the winter in the northern hemisphere and in the summer, our summer in the southern hemisphere. And so that's why typically it starts November to end of December, will be going up with peaks January, February, mainly in the U.S. That's why we recommend vaccination in October so you're primed and well prepared for the flu when it starts circulating in your area.
but it's never too late to get vaccinated.
No.
All right, so this one is for Renee, Chapter 6. So this is all about Station 11, presents the reality of all that has been lost in the post-collapse world, and we are left to imagine all that we ourselves stand to lose in a pandemic. From what we learn about the survivors and what they hope to preserve or regain, how can this help us relate to the social consequences of the pandemic?
It's a great question. And, we never had a poetry pandemic, but I like to think that if we did, it would be the happiest kind. And if you leave here today and you just can't help but write a poem, yes. And I'm going to actually start with the 1918 flu. And this is from a book called Miss 4th of July Goodbye. And it was set in Montgomery, West Virginia. Do we have anybody from Montgomery? No one? All right. Okay, fair enough. Close enough. So, but perhaps the saddest and the most feared sound of all in Montgomery these days and nights is the screeching sound of the ambulance. Most often, it means that someone with influenza is being taken to the hospital, or more tragic, being taken from the hospital to the funeral home. Many of these ambulances pass by our house, and of course, Papa and Mana and I wonder whether one time it will stop for one of us. So that's how they were thinking about it in these parts in 1918, right? And Station 11 is interesting, right? Because people start wandering after this flu, and they regroup, and they do this crazy thing. They get into theater and music. And the author tells us, but what made it bearable were the friendships, of course, the camaraderie and the music and the beauty and the joy. And I was thinking about that, and when you have something like an outbreak, right? You have some sort of catastrophic event, we're anxious, we're confused, and we have this sort of yearning, that human impulse for connection, right? And we know, for those of us who've read the book, that there's a really key phrase right about the center of the book when you see the caravan, the literal caravan of actors and musicians. And they have on there the text, because survival is insufficient. I think that's pretty powerful, right? And she also writes, and I think this is something that the colleagues I've gotten to work with out at the Health Science Center see every day. Being alive is a risk. It's right from the book, right? I mean, she's telling us these pretty amazing things for a work of fiction, right? She tells us the world becomes local, right? And I thought about this too in the wake of 9/11. People kind of clustered in their communities. And I would think that the same thing might happen. And I think she gives us a version of that in this book. And I guess to wrap up, and this is, happy thought for Tuesday afternoon. She says, hell is the absence of people you long for. And so when these things happen to us, maybe that's what we're really dealing with, what we really should be thinking about.
Thank you. In Station 11, I think it was really eye-opening how the capacity of the infrastructure wasn't there to handle a pandemic.
Not at all. I mean, we have so many things that connect us. And in the book, I mean, it just falls apart spectacularly. I mean, all of you right now texting your friends, I'm bored, would not be able to do that. And I know this happens because I teach undergraduates, right? I mean, but Lisa's football game doesn't happen, right? You probably aren't here getting a college education. I mean, you are not getting a non-fat latte at Starbucks. Consider that, right? And I jest a little, but we take for granted all these little things, all these little conveniences, they're just gone. And if you look at that chapter 6, I mean, it just lists out things. No more swimming pools, Think about that.
Yeah, I actually,
it's really very eye-opening. What is the capacity for our infrastructure? Could it happen just like we more prepared?
I don't know if I can answer that
I-
question. I'm
Yeah.
going to look
Okay,
down the panel
so,
here.
We are more prepared than we were, but we still are not. I mean, there's still a long way we could go. So I was counting, and I think if I remember, the book's like 90 in the book, influenza about 99% fatality. So that means of this room, one person would have survived. One person would leave today if we came in, coughed all over everybody. One person would have survived from today. If we look at the case of 1918, it was really about 3% fatality globally, which would mean that of this room, 3 people would die today from having been here and been exposed to the virus. And you think, okay, well, look at who 3 are they? Would the infrastructure handle that? Well, okay, 3% died, but let's say 30% of you got infected. And if 30% of your state is infected at one time, then 30% said 10 to 20% have to stay home to take care of the sick kids or sick spouse. That's 50% of the workforce out. Who's going to keep the electricity running? Who's going to drive the coal to the plant to run the electricity? Who's going to supply the food? Very few of you probably have enough food stockpiled in your house to not need to go to the grocery store that frequently. Who's going to be driving the food into your area? One, no one's going to want to come to your city, and 2, they may be sick as well. So even though the book is proposing a universe which is kind of inverse of what happened in 1918, even 1918 at that level shut down infrastructure, economies, and had a really profound impact. If I just want to say, I was in Sierra Leone for a while during the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And to control that, they actually made everyone go back to their hometown and stay there for 3 months. They closed businesses, cities shut off so people couldn't come or go from their little city or village. And that's how they were, and then instituted other practice. But those are the kind of things they had to do to control Ebola in their communities. And would you be, you do that, you go home, you can't leave, you can't go anywhere, you live you have to work in another county, sorry, you can't cross the county line, they won't let you. If we're not, we're not fully prepared. No.
Yeah, last week, CDC did release their mortality rates for flu last year, and it was 80,000 individuals in the United States died from influenza.
I'd like to bring one more piece to the table. Chickens. Why didn't everyone laugh? So the issue is that right now there's a huge demand for the eggs to make the current vaccine. So the moment a pandemic comes in, the majority of major vaccine makers are in the United States and France. So if there's not a supply of eggs, if the actual chickens are getting the influenza, that the whole chain could be quickly disrupted despite other potential vaccines that could work. So chickens will be a big player as well.
The drug, we have a national stockpile, but if we have a really significant pandemic, drugs will run out, things like masks, simple things, IV fluids. The hurricane in Puerto Rico showed how unstable our infrastructure is for certain medications, because I believe it was certain IV fluid came from, mainly the world supply came from one plant in Puerto Rico, which was put out of business. So if there's a pandemic and things aren't moving, we can't get supplies in from other places, and those places may want to keep their supplies because they want to treat their own population. So.
All right. Lisa, you said you already told the audience you don't want to sound like a broken record, but here's your chance again, because
Remember to repeat.
this
to
is
remember,
really
right?
important to sound like a broken record. Should you get a flu vaccine?
For those who know me, I'm not usually short-winded, but I would say the general answer is yes. So if you're older than 6 months old, which it looks like everyone in this room is, then it is recommended that you get the flu vaccine unless you have a contraindication. So what are some of the contraindications? So if you've had a flu vaccine and you had a severe reaction, say you had an anaphylactic reaction, a big word. So you weren't able to breathe. You maybe even needed intervention, like you needed medication to help you be able to breathe again. So epinephrine is usually the medicine that we give. That would be considered a contraindication to get the flu vaccine. But by and large, everyone, if you're of age, if you're greater than 6 months old, you should get a flu vaccine. If you're 6 to 8 year old, again, I still don't think I see anyone in that range. You actually need 2 doses of the vaccine to consider yourself being to sustain an immunologic response, which I'm sure Heath could speak more eloquently than I could to that. But for the most part, large and wide, we should all be getting the flu vaccine. There are some other examples that you should always, and I encourage you to talk with your physician about or your healthcare professional about. So there are certain conditions, like he mentioned the egg allergy. So now actually the recommendation is that if you have an egg allergy, you can actually receive any kind of form of the vaccine as long as you're just kind of monitored, depending upon what type of allergy you have to eggs, to be monitored after you've received the injection. You should probably be in a place where, in case you do have a significant reaction, you can get immediate intervention. And then there's some other conditions. If you have taken the flu shot questionnaire to get your vaccine at W Medicine, there's many different questions. And one of them, they talk about this condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so if you've had that condition, it's recommended that you talk it over with your physician before you would proceed with immunization. So by and large, most of the people in this room, I think, would probably fall into the category that we can all be vaccinated, but you should certainly have that discussion with your healthcare professional. And as I mentioned before, it's not only helping yourself if you get the flu vaccine, but really there's a double be part of a team, and you can be part of that herd immunity where if we're able to keep the disease out of our communities, then we can prevent the spread of the disease. So perhaps someone is not able to get a vaccine because they're too young or they've had one of those severe reactions. By everybody else being immunized and having protection, we're able to have a kind of community defense against the virus. So it's not only helping yourself. Before I came here, I talked to some of my colleagues and I said, if you're going to go talk to a big panel, what would you say? Why should you get the flu shot? And every one of them said, because you're not only helping yourself, you're helping somebody else. So I think that at the end of the day, if you can try to help somebody else, that's making a big benefit. And then in this case, you also help yourself too. So by and large, get your flu vaccine. There's many different flu shot clinics. I think there was one today. You could probably step out. I think it goes till 5. You could probably go get your flu shot real quick and come back. But certainly would recommend that you get your flu shot. And we haven't really talked a lot about, there are different types of the vaccine. So there's the typical shot that you would think of like getting a shot in your arm. And there's also a live vaccine, which is a nasal vaccine. And there's been more controversy around that vaccine. Last year, it wasn't recommended because what they had seen when they were tracking it really didn't provide as much immunity as one would think. And that is actually a live virus vaccine, not like the one you get in your arm, which is an inactivated vaccine. So let me just state this as clear as I can. You do not get the flu from getting the flu shot. It's a common misconception, but you might, could have been sick already, but the flu shot does not cause the flu. So let me just put that all aside. I should almost have you say it with me. Does the flu shot cause the flu? Oh, very good. All right. Success. That's success. I should stop now. But so there is this live vaccine. It's not as routinely offered anymore because there's been some hesitancy in regards to how effective it is. And actually the American Academy of Pediatrics, which was I'm involved with nationally, they actually don't recommend that children get that as first line. They recommend that you get the flu shot. So the shot in the arm is the first line for the vaccine. But if there's no other option available and someone is eligible to get that live vaccine, that would be an appropriate alternative. But by and large, everyone should get the inactivated vaccine, the shot in the arm.
Because I do believe the flu mist is back for 2018, correct?
It is. The flu mist is back, but like I said, there are certain individuals who should not probably receive that because it is a live vaccine. So perhaps you have an underlying respiratory problem, like you have asthma, or for my patients I care for with cystic fibrosis, we would not want to offer the live vaccine to them. And I'm sure Heath could speak more to the difference about the live versus the inactivated vaccine. But it is back, the flu mist, the one that, if anyone had heard of that you kind of get in the nose. So they've made some changes to the vaccine, so they feel like it's going to be more effective when they've looked at it. However, from the pediatric literature, it was still not recommended first line that be the vaccine offered. But with all that being said, if that's the only vaccine available, it's still better to be vaccinated than to not be vaccinated.
All right, this one's for Marina. It's been suggested that vaccines and how well they work have been their own worst enemy. That is, as public memory of pandemic illness fades, or the devastation of some of these infectious diseases that are preventable with vaccines, the urgency to vaccinate also dims. What are some of the legitimate concerns regarding vaccine skepticism?
So, as a part of the training for the pharmacy students, we want to educate the population. We are all very fortunate. We are all in a bubble because we all believe or have critical thinking to see what is scientifically proved. However, our patients are being exposed to all kinds of information. You are going to have patients come in saying, I heard this from the radio, I heard this from the media, this actress has been associating autism with certain vaccines. The challenge is for us to educate and to filter what is being scientifically proved and what is not. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of stigma is that I got the flu when I got vaccinated. And if you recall, the time that the vaccine developed or trained that immune system is between 2 to 4 weeks. So if you don't have symptoms and you already have the flu on you and you get the vaccine, you're going to associate things. And you're going to say, oh, I got sick because of the flu, right? And I was already sick. There's other problems like how well we can, government-wise, we can involve and force people to get vaccinated the same way that small kids get vaccinated for certain vaccines when they get into school, or health sciences, we have to be vaccinated with the flu shot. Why we have to regulate that? So there are some movements, anti-vax, that they're saying you should not be regulating what should I be putting in my body. Other issues will be religious. So you remember most of the vaccines are going to be egg. So some of them are going to be on a different animal model. And what if you are vegetarian or you are vegan? What are you going to do? Well, that won't be eligible, right? That will be against your belief, against your moral. So again, all these challenges that we have to filter the information and educate our patients. And I have to reinforce the amazing job that we're doing in the community, like Dr. Gary Foley or Dr. Barrickman or Dr. Macmillan, and educating patients and getting vaccinated as well.
All right, so the last question. When we experience sickness, before we open it up for the audience, so when we experience sickness, it is natural to want to find a cause or to otherwise make some sense of it. When we don't know what that cause is, as in the case of the prophet, our fears and biases can misinform our passion for answers. How can understanding the prophet from Station 11 help us reframe responsibility and accountability in relation to the spread of illness?
I got asked to take this question, so I read the campus read with you all, and I think in chapter 18 I took notes on my phone, so I'm going to use that. But I think in chapter 18 it talks about how some of these different communities, not all of them, but some of them were quote unquote taken over by cults, and that really became the most dangerous. And I think when you speak of the prophet, he certainly was kind of in charge of his cult, and he did some really not good things, not nice things that I think in a society that we think of right now would not be a social norm, and there would be laws that they would, get put in prison or at least be arrested or be reprimanded for that type of behavior. But in the case of this book, where there's this Georgia flu pandemic and there's been the collapse, you kind of have these pockets and some people rise to power. And I think what they said in the book as well was that they live by an entirely different logic, that they're illogical and you really can't even reason with them. And I think that was the case with the prophet, and that there are certain situations where they have beliefs that are contrary to perhaps what we know as social norms or what we have proven through science. So us up here on this panel, we're all scientists, and we try to use evidence-based medicine. As a physician, that's what I try to do. I try to stay as up to date as possible. That evidence certainly can change, but we certainly want to stay up to date and provide recommendations from what we know is the best. Before vaccines, there were individuals who were walking or not walking because maybe they contracted polio or some serious disease. And nowadays, we don't see that as much. As an early career physician, I'm glad that I've just read about those in books, that we've been able to see the success of vaccines, that I've not cared for an individual that has active polio. But if vaccinations would go away, we perhaps would see them return. I think we very likely would. And so that's why there's a threat that we see. I think Marina talked about it nicely, that there is a threat that we see with some illogical. It's hard to reason with them. I think we joke now. Columbus Day was just recently, right? Was it like yesterday? So there was this whole like flat earth movement, and now people would be like, that's ridiculous. I mean, the earth is not flat. But for a long time, that was what the common belief was, and there were many arguments, and there was belief to that. And then over time, it was proven over and over again that that is not the case, that the earth is actually not flat. And so in situations like we see in Station 11, where there's an individual, they can kind of infiltrate and they are somewhat illogical in their rationale, but then there's other people who believe them. So I think a corollary would be in Minnesota, there was an outbreak of measles in a Somali refugee camp, because in that group, it was postulated to them that vaccines were not safe and that they were potentially trying to cause harm. And so a lot of those individuals did not get vaccinated against measles, and then there was an outbreak within that community. And so there was a lot of misinformation that then kind of spread throughout, and it was hard for healthcare professionals. I have colleagues in Minnesota who were on the front lines, and they had to go and try to educate and then get trust from the public. And so I think sometimes it can also be like a cancer that metastasizes of misinformation, and it gets spread. And so that's why I think it's important to be at events like this and really talk to the experts or do research on your own and know where you're getting your information from. So there's a lot of information out there on the internet. In Chapter 6, it goes away. In Station 11, they lost their Wi-Fi, which was just like catastrophic to me personally. But that's what happened in this book. And I think that that's what made it hard in this book, is because some people forgot what it was like. So they talk about that in the later chapters of the book, right? They forgot about what it was like, especially the young people. What was it like before the Georgia flu? They couldn't even remember. There were some individuals who had never lived in a world before the Georgia flu. So they only kind of lived in this post-collapsed world. And so it was hard to kind of challenge this powerful being and to question his authority, because he obviously knew so much. And so I think we see that now, that there's a lot of misinformation. As I said, I'm a hashtag Tweediatrician. I love using social media, but there can be a lot of misinformation out there. We're in this era of fake news, right? I mean, if you don't hear fake news about a single day, then you're probably not watching the news at all, because someone's talking about fake news. But so where do you get your information from? So going to places like the CDC or the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Physicians, trying to go to evidence-based resources to get your information and make those decisions are really important.
And the challenge we have with the vaccines, that even though that misinformation was released and was taken back, saying that, well, that correlation between, and in this case was measles with autism, it was not real, the damage is already there. The public has lost the trust. They lost the trust of the CDC and the FDA because of the excipient they were using. They were using thimerosal. So now FDA said, okay, let's remove the thimerosal from the formulation so we can give peace to the population. So now the population start thinking, well, if you remove it, it's because actually you were hiding something to us. So again, I feel the way of improving the vaccination is to reinstate that trust to the community, saying we are providing help here. We're not trying to damage anybody. But yeah, the damage is there.
Well, and to bring it back to that particular character. So that character is a young boy when civilization falls apart. And at one point in the scene is really burned in my head, because I had the very bad luck of picking up this book and reading it and being in an airport. Don't do that.
The Museum of Civilization.
Right.
Were you just seeing visions of that?
So the little boy goes out to this plane this plane is full of people who died of the flu. We find out that it has been quarantined. And then he starts sort of lecturing to the plane, trying to explain to the people that this is just what happened to you. And, maybe you just weren't good people. And, the rest of us who are alive are better people. And if we saw a little boy today, like talking to an airplane full of people, we would probably intervene, I would think. Right. And so I think about that when I think about, what my colleagues have said, like it starts there. And then he builds a whole ideology around this thing that happened when he was really quite young, and then doesn't remember the world before that. And I think that that's an interesting thing from a character development point of view, but also from like understanding how misinformation about health can happen point of view as well. And he's sort of that character that can be a cautionary tale to us.
And the only thing that I will add, because I've not said, I think we've talked a lot about science, but at the end of the day, we are talking about people and humans, and that there needs to be a level of compassion. It's scary to get sick. I mean, has anyone been sick or maybe had a loved one who was sick or you had an injury? I mean, it can be personally scary. And so a lot of the times when we're dealing with this, I think that was the interesting of this book. They talk a lot about the arts, and like me, I'm like, why are they worried about a traveling symphony? Like people, what they're worried about. But I think it's important because when you get back to the human connection of it, it is important that there's the art and there's that human connection. And hearing the fears, I think like Marina was talking about, I mean, I talk with vaccine hesitant patients and parents and families, and I use my experience and what I've learned here through 3 degrees at West Virginia University, that I'm very happy to be a mountaineer, to say this is what I know and this is from my experiences and this is what I hear from you, but this is why I think this is what the best recommendation is. So I think to underscore the compassion, it's easy to take advantage of someone perhaps when they're in that scared perspective. And so being able to relate and listen to them, but then provide your experience and knowledge and what we know can be the best for the public as well as for the individual.
Yeah, I'd have to echo that belief. I mean, I think sometimes you can throw facts at so many people, but I've also, there's a good body of research that shows that a feeling can never be displaced except with another feeling. And I think that's the beauty of stuff like Renee's work with narrative medicine, is bringing the compassionate stories into it and hearing from those individuals that have been directly affected by these types of diseases that are easily preventable nowadays. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to the audience. So there's 2 mics on each side. So if somebody has a question or 2 questions, please feel free.
Thanks to all of you for being here today. An excellent panel. I guess if we imagine a few hundred planes going down and all the people dying, that's what we're really talking about with the people who died of flu last year. Yet I'm wondering, why aren't our commercials better for vaccination if that's the case? Because it's a people-to-people thing, and maybe we should be showing more people dying or more stories of people dying. That's what's going to get people's hearts to be able to change their minds, I think. So I really, the question I have is, what do you guys think about the way that the CDC or others are advertising vaccines and how that should change?
So I actually would counter that. I thought I saw a whooping cough commercial, and Jennifer Lopez was the spokesperson for it. And I guess the target audience was the Hispanic population that was getting heavily affected by this disease. And I thought that was brilliant. But yeah, I don't see anything with flu and commercials. Anybody want to contribute anything?
Sure. So I think Heath explained it very easily, but for the large population, immunity is a very complex concept to articulate, and you did a very, very nice job of that. So I do a lot of work with policy, and when I talk with legislators, most legislators aren't trained in healthcare of any regard, and so it's really hard to kind of break it down and really be able to express succinctly what immunity is. So I think there's that makes it challenging of how can you succinctly describe the importance of vaccines and why it's important that we all kind of get it very, in a 30-second media clip. I think it's just a really challenging thing to do. There are people who are better at it. And even though it's challenging, doesn't mean that we shouldn't take that on. So I think by utilizing different marketing resources, whether it's social media, print media, radio, TV, kind of across the board, but really just having those discussions one-on-one and with individuals, and particularly your healthcare professional, to have that discussion with them, and really that we should be giving those recommendations. I think we can always do better at communicating in medicine and healthcare in general, but certainly kind of, I think from a public health perspective, you see a lot of that, get your flu shot, and perhaps, imparting some history on it. So if you look at the exhibit out that when I walked in this morning, I looked at the exhibit that's out by the pianos that you all can check out afterwards. And you don't really remember or see those things now because we do live in a world that has had vaccines. So it's hard for people to remember what it was like before that, kind of like in the book, right? So the pre-collapse world, some of us, it's hard for us to remember what it was like to have a loved one with polio because we've been able to pretty much eradicate that from North America. So I think it can be challenging. We're almost a victim of our own success. These diseases are still out there. It's just that we've gotten better at preventing them from happening. So I think we need to do a better job and take baby steps and just bring up the conversation and share that information. I think that's what Marina's doing, in her class by having debates. And so I think we can always do more, but we're making little steps and trying to get better at those marketing tactics that were kind of mentioned already.
I always think I love that the question, because I always think that those advertisements for flu treatment, like medication, or the nose congestion, I don't know why they don't say, please stay at home until you feel better. They always say consult with your doctor or your pharmacist and so on, but they should say stay at home, protect yourself and the rest.
Well, there's actually an interesting kind of economic piece to this. It's actually thought, people think that vaccines make a lot of money, and actually they do not, because they save a lot of money and they save lives. But the reality is the cost to manufacture and quality control and distribute is incredible. So that's why it's difficult to develop new vaccines. And so there's the manufacturers themselves are working with profit margins and what they do. The CDC, I think the website, in my opinion, the last 5 years has improved a lot with more information that's written for people seeking these things, not just healthcare professionals alone. So there is an economic piece to it as well. Vaccines don't make a lot of money, they save a lot of money.
So I started thinking about it too. Like, what would Don Draper have done with this, right? From Mad Men, right? And he was all about that emotional connection. And then I immediately thought of this commercial that ran when I was a kid. And it was all part of the, just say no to drugs. And there was this frying pan. And they said, this is drugs. And then they cracked the egg and they said, this is your brain on drugs. And it's sizzling. And then they say, any questions? And it was pretty clear what they were going for there. And then I'm thinking, well, how in the heck do you get that with vaccines? But then I started to think about the current commercial with like Alan Alda and the people from Grey's Anatomy and Scrubs and Doogie Howser MD, and they're like the TV doctors of America. And I'm like, yeah, those guys need to say, get your vaccine. And probably everybody would, because who doesn't listen to McDreamy?
And I think it's very complicated because we are poor at risk perception. People in general are poor at risk perception. So today I told you that rabies kills approximately 50,000 people globally every year. Influenza in the United States kills approximately 50,000 people every year. Which one are you more worried about when you leave this building? You're still probably more worried about getting rabies than dying from flu. But so flu, people think, oh, it's just the flu. Because people think anything that gives them a runny nose and maybe a cough is the flu. No, flu is going to lay you up for 3 days, maybe a week. You probably feel crappy for 2 weeks. Then you may get bronchitis and you're out for another. And the antibiotics you get for that may give you GI upset for 2 weeks after that. So you may be feeling sick for 6 weeks. And you're going to be missing classes. But people just think, oh, it's the flu. I'm not too worried about it, and go on. So it's very hard to combat that. And I think that's where, there's a lot of work on behavior in the behavioral sciences to try and figure out how do we really motivate people? Do you scare them? Do you, because some things just haven't seemed to work.
We're seeing stuff like CVS. We walked in there the other day and they said, $25 flu vaccine, get $5 back, right? So there's some incentives that are kind of interesting in that respect. Also, do you anybody feel comfortable? What's the average number of a typical flu case? How many more infections you're going to go and produce?
Well, everyone's looking at me. I'm not sure that data exists. I know that there's cost analysis, and Heath was kind of getting at the costs that are saved. But there are last year there were over 200,000 associated influenza hospitalizations, and just on a roundabout number, 80% of those who get hospitalized did not have the flu vaccine. And so a lot of the people that I have the real privilege to care for, they are higher risk. So they're children, and they're the elderly, or they have cystic fibrosis. And so those individuals have been in the hospital. Perhaps they need to be intubated on a ventilator, which is not really an area that we talked about in regards to getting to a pandemic. When how do you have all the capacity to care for these people that are going to need these really advanced medical equipment? We've kind of seen a reduction in hospitals in rural areas as we've moved to a more managed care system, putting on like a public policy hat. And so I think that the cost is high. And I mean, I always like to say, if one person, every person matters, every life matters. And I think that if we can prevent one death, that's important to do that. And, we have a lot of advancements we've made in medicine, but we still have more advancements to go. I mean, the flu vaccine is an example of that. We would love to have a universal vaccine, but we're just not there yet. Hopefully one day we will get there. But the cost, I think there were some cost projection. It's maybe close to, it's multiple millions. I don't want to put the B word that it's billions, but it's a significant cost to society, not to mention the social loss that you experienced.
Thank you all for being here. I definitely appreciate the panel so far. My name is Marco Schaff. I'm a second-year health policy student in the School of Public Health. We had a quote earlier in the discussion about scientific illiteracy, and I believe the quote was that we can't reason with them. And I hesitate to call something that causes 50,000 deaths a year at low stakes, but this is something that, kills more people than gun violence in this country and gets a tiny fraction of the sort of political attention. And I'm just wondering, what is the role of civil rights and even human rights when it comes to, should people have an option about this? Thank you.
Y'all are looking at me again. This is
When
a
we-
packed question.
Should I jump in with the band? So when I
Go
spoke
ahead.
to the students, they have to do, some of them will be taking the position of being anti-vax. So they have to be looking at all the different information that is being out there. So you prepare yourself much better to face what you have to address. And one thought, and we have discussed this for a few years, is where your freedom ends. So a lot of anti-vax are advocating, I have the freedom of not giving this vaccine to myself or to my children, but that it's a compromise when your freedom is damaging or harming someone. So that correlation, that explanation, that discerning is hard to convey when you are having a strong opinionated person saying, oh, I have my freedom of doing whatever I want with my body. I think until we cannot foresee and explain what are the consequences of that, I don't think we can overcome this challenge, honestly speaking.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think there's a lot of society when you talk about public policy. I mean, there's risk with everything, right? I mean, there certainly are risks with getting a vaccine. I think the risks are low and the benefits far outweigh them. I mean, I could trip walking up steps. Fortunately, I have a great physical therapist who's going to probably prevent that from happening. But I think that, we have risks in everything that we do. And the point that you bring up is, at what point is this going to impact somebody else? So we have laws for that we have to wear seatbelts, or we have to have car seats, or we have to have a pool around a fence, because we have learned over time from a public health perspective that there are risks and we can kind of mitigate those risks. And so when it comes to vaccines in West Virginia, us along with Mississippi and California have very high vaccination rates for school entry, because we have strong public health policy that we, including WVU Health Sciences Center, advocate strongly towards maintaining, because we do have these high rates of vaccinations. Flu, as a disclaimer, is not one of those required school entry vaccines, but as I mentioned earlier, healthcare professionals, there is that policy in place because we are at higher risk, because we're exposed to individuals who have flu. I've cared for multiple children and adults who have contracted the flu, so we're at higher risk. So it's a duty that we have to try to prevent them as well, in addition to doing all the things that we all should be doing. Like Marina was saying, like it should be wash your hands, stay at home. If you're sick, wear a mask, those type of common sense things that we can each do that perhaps we don't do. But I do think that it becomes this challenging discussion, because people talk about, well, it's my freedom to make that decision. But in the case of vaccination and communicable diseases, it really is where one person's decision could impact somebody else's. So I do think it's a civil rights discussion. That's why we in West Virginia do have the recommended policy for that when it comes to school age related vaccinations. We could do much better in early age of life, so we still have work to do there, but there's certainly a public policy aspect to this.
And if I can comment to take it a little further, there actually is influenza. It's unique probably among diseases in that, as I said, the WHO with countries, including the CDC, have for 70 some years had a program of surveillance, and it was mainly laboratory surveillance. So going out and actually swabbing people, getting the viruses, growing the viruses up, analyzing them, and then the ones of particular submitting them to a global reference centers to be evaluated for consideration and to being put into vaccines. So what that means is this program, which is now 140 some labs in 114 countries around the world, monitor these viruses and send them to like 6 collaborating centers where they analyze the viruses and say which among all of these should be in the vaccine for the Northern Hemisphere or for the Southern Hemisphere this year. And so then these candidate viruses get developed, and then vaccine manufacturers take them and put them in the vaccines. And so it's around 2006 when avian influenza H5N1, which had a 60% case fatality rate, was spreading across the world. The WHO was very interested in getting those viruses in so they could make vaccines. But the countries where these outbreaks were occurring were places like Indonesia and these developing countries where they cannot afford the vaccine once it's made. And so their feeling was, you are coming in, we're giving you our viruses, you're making a vaccine. When a pandemic hits, we can't buy it, we can't afford it. We're not getting anything out of this deal. Why should we be involved? So WHO set up a program called the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, PIP, where the vaccine manufacturers donate millions of dollars into a fund that is then used to help develop influenza surveillance capacity countries, and to help get them supplies, and to help guarantee that during a pandemic, they would be guaranteed so much vaccine given to those countries. So flu, actually, the Global Influenza Program globally has recognized this disparity and is trying to do things to help offset some of that.
And I think when we talk about freedom, that we really have to look 360. And I'm a person who lives in stories. And I have an autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis. And when other people don't get vaccinated, that affects me very, very personally. But I don't know if they're thinking about my freedom. And it's not just my freedom, it's the 60 to 100 students I teach every semester. And it's the people that I write stories with in the infusion center who are getting chemotherapy. Because when I have the flu, I can't go in there and do their stories at a time that stories are really important to them and to their loved ones, right? And I'm just one person telling one personal story. So it's a very complicated issue. And here's the thing. I would allow the space for those who, don't believe in vaccination to tell their stories. But I would hope that they would afford me the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, I think we have to be very good at sharing the facts, but also sharing our stories. And on that vein, I mean, I'll share my story in that I'm a first generation American, and I, both on my maternal and paternal side, I would have one more aunt and one more uncle if they had not died during childhood from a preventable disease. Those vaccines were not available where my parents had lived. So that's my personal story. And I think that this, the world needs facts and then these personal stories. And we have to share them, and we have to also listen to them. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank everyone for attending our panel this afternoon. I'd also like to thank each of our panel members and our moderator for sharing their expertise and perspectives. There are a few things we'd like to mention. We'd like to invite you to the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of Natural History exhibit, Outbreak Epidemics in a Connected World, which is currently on display in the Life Science Building on the downtown campus. You can see that during business hours through the end of this semester, so I would encourage you to go down and take a look at that. Finally, Dr. Paul Offit will be giving a lecture, Scientific Misadventures, Learning from the Past, on November 15th at 4 p.m. in the Fukushima Auditorium. Dr. Offit is the chief of the Division of Infectious Disease and the director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the founding director of the Autism Science Foundation. So please make sure to try to get out for that. There is a reception following the panel discussion out in the pylons area, which you're all welcome to attend. If you're a student here to get credit for 191, please make sure you've signed in just outside the room before you leave. And that concludes our panel for today. Thank you.
And get your flu shot.
And get your flu shot.
Fun. You explained that very well. I know. I'm like, I understand something scientific.
I teach a course in vaccinology, so
Okay.
every day talking.
That's awesome.
I was expecting pieces.
Nice meeting you officially. Now, like when I've seen you all around. It was nice meeting you too. Nice meeting you. Good seeing you again.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah, please.
Yes.
You have probably been email, yeah?
I do.
Okay, perfect.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, pleasure. Thank you. Yeah. You're not done.